Alors, je vais juste introduire le prochain panel. I'm going to introduce the next panel, which is going to talk about local, national, and global strategies to combating antibiotic resistance. Alors, les stratégies locales, nationales et mondiales de la lutte contre la résistance aux antibiotiques. And I will introduce our moderator for the panel, Professor Steven Hoffman, again, Director of the Global Strategy Lab, who will introduce our individual speakers and panelists today. All right, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi à tous. So we get to, after we've had a great lunch, thank you, Ottawa Law Review, for that, and after a great morning of discussion, this panel is our opportunity to talk about various strategies that can help address this problem, the root of the problem, as well as the way it manifests in population health perspective. So we get views from the local level. We'll have national views as well as global strategies. That will include a range of issues. We'll talk about research and development. We'll talk about policy. We'll talk about law reform. So without further ado, I'll introduce each panelist just before they present. So we're going to start with Professor David Patrick, who's a professor and director of the UBC School of Population and Public Health. Dr. Patrick is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in internal medicine, an infectious disease physician and epidemiologist, and has really been leading a school at UBC that is really well known for not only doing excellent public and population health research, but also making sure that that research actually matters and makes a difference. And so it's, as if anyone who's reading the newspaper knows, that the team of faculty that he leads at UBC is always in the newspaper and always causing trouble in the best ways to agitate for change. So, Professor, thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephen, and it's good to be back up again. I think my slides are about to come up. And while they are, I'll say it was a really good idea to get the guy who has the most jet lag to do the postprandial leg, on this sort of thing. Now, some of the things we talk about have a risk of overlap, so what I'm going to do is concentrate on the things that we haven't really talked about yet. And in particular, you had a great introduction to natural selection from a lawyer this morning, and so I really don't need to go over that in detail again. So this is just my sources of funding and no conflicts of interest with industry or anything. But some of our work is actually the BC branch of the Do Bugs Need Drugs program. This is a program we share with Alberta. And this actually begins to bridge into the idea of what can you do for that 85% of antimicrobial consumption that is community-based. So I put some objectives together. You want to overview the growing problem. That's already been done, really. Discuss the factors promoting resistance, and then discuss current issues in Canadian law that contribute to the challenge or might pose solutions. So the interesting thing is we've heard about how grave this is, but 2013 was kind of interesting because you had nation states beginning to stand up and say, look, we've got 23,000 deaths in Europe. This is getting quite serious. But take it closer to home. Take it to your family doctor. And compared to 20 years ago, you've now got about a quarter of urinary tract infections and a quarter of skin and soft tissue infections that are much harder to treat than they used to be. And so we're talking about tens of thousands of cases in a province like Ontario or Quebec or British Columbia that are more difficult to manage or need different antibiotic selections. It's already a big problem. Where could it go? The problem is not just that it makes it difficult to treat infections, but so much of our surgery, our transplants, our cancer therapy depends on our ability to manage infectious disease complications of immunosuppression. So, there are knockdown effects here that could be quite grave. And of course, as we saw in West Africa recently, and as we're seeing currently, in the Zika zone, infectious diseases, when they're uncontrolled, hurt economies as well. So you've had the Kaufman, Stephen's version of natural selection already well explained. The natural selection is driven by use in people and I dare say our pets as well. We can't forget veterinary medicine here, and in food production. But its spread, once evolved, is really important to take into mind. We've got importation. Wherever we get importation into dense populations, whether it's a dense chicken coop or a densely populated hospital, we see more rapid spread. And we see a reduction in spread by maneuvers that include good hygiene, the sort of stuff where you may do good hand washing and that kind of thing, infection control in hospitals, sanitation in community, and infection control in healthcare. Now, the WHO put out a great document, just sort of painting the way in which to respond to this, and I think it's helped guide a number of agencies over time. And it lays out these spheres of activity. First of all, timely ongoing surveillance. And this is not just for trends in resistance and trends in morbidity from these drugs, these resistant organisms, but we need to follow trends in antimicrobial utilization. So transparency in all sectors, agricultural, veterinary, community human, hospital human, this way, is critical. We need to reduce unnecessary antibiotic use in people and in animals in all spheres. That's stewardship. We need to limit the spread in the community and in healthcare facilities. And so that's hospital infection control. That's where the rubber hits the road in terms of our sickest people. But it's also our overall standards of community and sanitation and hygiene in communities. And so when we had a flu pandemic and we're getting people to say, cough into your sleeve and things, it still remains important. And of course, we need to encourage the development of new antibiotics, and you've already been introduced to the very logical reasons why there's been a complete commercial failure to do so in the last 20 years or so, and why we need different models of discovery. Different models of discovery aren't new to Canada. When we decided we had to get into the vaccine preventable diseases game, you had government investment in the Connaught labs in Toronto, and that led to Canada being the first virtually diphtheria-free country in the world. So those sorts of things can occur, but it's not the current model in the post-Reagan Thatcher era with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's bits of good news. This is probably a trend which is seen to varying different degrees in the rest of Canada, but this is just the rate of prescribing antibiotics adjusted for population. And forget the y-axis in too much detail, but you're down about 25% in a place like BC. But within a big trend like that, you miss things. You miss the fact that a lot of the docs are bringing it down. As I mentioned this morning, the pediatricians are working harder than anybody else at that. Meanwhile, the dentists are prescribing more, and we need to work with them. On the agricultural side, we have different reasons why the antibiotics are used, and these have been introduced. The top one, treatment, echoes back and forth across human and animal health. We are one health. We're all animals, and it's nice to be able to treat sickness. Prophylaxis is used in a very limited sense in human health, but prophylaxis is a major indication, prophylaxis at the level of flock or herd in agriculture. And finally, growth promotion, as we heard this morning, is a reason why antibiotics are used. This is being there's certainly good evidence that it works in some cases, but there's some thought now that the original evidence in some sectors, like poultry, was actually paltry. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So, for example, growth promoters in broiler chickens. Believe it or not, there was a great randomized controlled trial in the American Northeast of growth promoters in chicken. They did indeed show that the antibiotics made the chickens grow faster, but to the order of 1 or 1.5% in mass. So if you subject that to an economic analysis, this wasn't worth it in terms of the value of the meat, let alone the risk to health. So I think a lot of poultry producers are beginning to buy this re-examination of the evidence. We know that a lot more antibiotics are used in food production than in all of human medicine. Now, that statistic does sound pretty scary sometimes, but it's also important to bear in mind that a large proportion of that are compounds that are never considered for use in human medicine. The only thing is that we're never quite sure what may become important down the road. So for years, colistin was a drug we didn't really want to use in human medicine because it's essentially a detergent that's fairly toxic. Now it's a drug of last resort, and meanwhile that message probably didn't get across to agriculture, at least Chinese agriculture. And that led to the natural selection of the most worrisome new gene we've seen. We know that drug resistance is seen in bacteria on Canadian meat, and even the limited amount of surveillance that's going on with Salmonella and Campylobacter can demonstrate that. We know that drug-resistant bacteria that come through the food chain clearly cause some human infections, but to be fair, we also have to point out that the majority of serious resistant infections are passed person to person. And I really want to underscore the fact that you know, it's bound to happen statistically if antibiotics are used anywhere that genes will emerge in a sector. So the MCR1 gene, as we heard this morning, definitely did evolve from through agriculture, or get selected anyway. So what happened in the States? The black bars are rates of finding of resistant organisms, 2 different resistant organisms on U.S. organic farms before they transitioned to lower use of antibiotics. And the blue ones are after they have made the transition. So it's very clear that while in human health it takes a long time to change antibiotic resistance patterns when you change drug use, in poultry production it happens almost overnight. Why? Because you basically cull the whole flock of broilers and clean out the facility and you're into a new sort of thing. So you can change the situation very quickly if you choose to move. The UK PM commissioned a report chaired by Jim O'Neill. They recommended that we have global targets to reduce antibiotic use in food production, a measurable, you know, per kilogram of livestock and so forth, and that we try and stick to that. So that's reinforcing this morning's messages about international collaboration towards those sorts of goals. The rapid development of minimum standards to reduce antimicrobial manufacturing waste is also important. So far we've not talked about that, but a big problem in the Indian environment, the Indian subcontinent, has been that there's been a lot of drug manufacturing and a lot of antibiotics have got out into rivers, which then cycle back into the water system, etc. Probably contributed to NDM1 development. And we need improved surveillance to monitor those problems and progress against targets. Now, the policy tools that are available are regulation to reduce use. Those are pretty clear. Tax is actually possible in undesirable settings. We talked about making sure that we reward production of new antibiotics in different ways, but there are also different sort of ways to disincentivize the use in inappropriate settings. Or alternately, and importantly, subsidizing the cost of using alternative strategies. And this isn't just in human medicine, infection control and vaccines. This is in agriculture. We heard about vaccines in salmon. There are important vaccines in cattle that are not being used, that could be used. And remember that if you prevent an infection in the first place, you don't need to worry about how to treat it with antibiotics. Now, it's important to bear in mind that there's some of the realities here in Canada is we have a complex landscape. Federal acts and regulations include the Food and Drug Act, the Feeds Act, the Health of Animals Act, and there are people far more expert on these who are going to speak in the symposium following this one. And the provinces, of course, don't have to toe the line completely on what goes on federally. They regulate the sale of drugs within a province, and this gives them the right to regulate more stringently, but not more leniently, the sale of drugs once they're approved at the federal level. The issue is that the ability to prescribe is determined province by province. So what are our Canadian gaps? Data on antibiotic use in animals is still hard to come by, and those of you who know it know that it's still pretty high level, not very granular, very difficult to say what's going on sector by sector. Regulatory loopholes need to either be closed or monitored. So most of you have heard that we have this own use provision where a farmer can bring a drug back across the border for use on their own land, and that's virtually untrackable. The reasons for putting it in place were actually so that Canadian producers could compete with American producers using similar drug costs, and not all the drugs they bring back are antibiotics. So we're mostly concerned about this because of antibiotics, not because of all the drug that they bring back. Over-the-counter sales happen in agriculture as well. And so we really feel that all antibiotic use should be transparent and ideally under the management of a doctor or a vet, but this is not always going to be possible for every food production operation. And of course, trade could be at risk in two different ways. If we do something that's more costly before the U.S. does within NAFTA, then our producers suffer. But also, if we're not moving fast enough when the U.S. needs food that's produced in a different way, or the European markets want it produced in a different way, that could cost us potentially much more. So we've also had progress, and we'll hear more from our colleagues at the Public Health Agency, but since we got public about this sort of stuff a few years ago, we now have a national strategy on antibiotic resistance. We have much improved availability of surveillance reports. We've got Health Canada announcing a plan for voluntary elimination of antibiotics as growth promoters. Now, that could tip the other way, and we could have antibiotics used as herd prophylaxis in just the same amounts. So we really have to see how that goes. It could be a semantic victory. But veterinarians essentially fall under provincial jurisdiction and can prescribe whatever antibiotics they want to. So whatever happens at Health Canada doesn't determine everything. Only in Quebec are farmers required to get prescriptions from vets to buy antibiotics. So that's about what I had to say, just to get the conversation going, and I'll stop for questions.
Great. Are there one or two questions that we can pose to Professor Patrick as the slides are loading for the next speaker? Yep. Great.
Okay, let's see if I can do this at an appropriate distance this time. Just, I guess, a technical question related to the MCR1 gene that you referenced. My understanding was that that was particularly dangerous because it was located on the bacterial plasmid, meaning that it could transfer that resistance not only within that species but to others as well. Just, can you give a general idea of how likely that is to occur? I mean, the danger that it can occur is very, very bad. But my understanding is we went sort of backwards. We discovered this in 2015. We went backwards and we saw that there was surveillance data on this going back to 2012. And yet in the intervening period, you didn't see a lot of colistin resistance. So how likely is that transmission to occur to other bacterial species once it is discovered on the bacterial plasmid?
I really like your question. I don't know if are these on? Yeah, I really like your question because it allows us to sort of sit back and say, what is the real unit of analysis here? Are we really worried about antimicrobial organisms at the most fundamental level, or are we worried about these genes, particularly when they're on transposable genetic elements like plasmids? And the unit of analysis we really have to worry about the most are the genes and the combinations of genes that can move between organisms. Yes, the MCR1 discovery is concerning because you have a mobile element that's quite capable of jumping into organisms, and some of them could be organisms that also have the CPE. So you combine those things together, and then you have something that looks pretty well untreatable, at least, and unless you're using radical combinations and all sorts of other issues. I agree with you, though, that it was somewhat reassuring that when people went back into their banks and said, yeah, well, have we seen this before? Yeah, it's probably been around for a while. We just didn't know to look for it, or we didn't do enough whole genome sequencing to find it. Before this particular thing came along. If you ask me to assess a probability that it could join with other genes and cause a really, really bad superbug, you're asking me just to predict chaos. But the main thing is that it's possible, and evolution, or at least the movement of genetic material between organisms does follow chaos. Sooner or later, stuff happens. And the real question then is if the non-chaotic element of evolution is allowed to come into bear, and that means natural selection against that organism. If that happens in an environment where there are a lot of antibiotics and you give that bug an advantage, then you've got a problem. So our best defenses remain stewardship against this kind of thing, as well as good surveillance.
Thank you very much.
Great. So we'll now proceed to the next speaker in this panel. So like Professor Patrick, our next speaker is also doing double duty. So we appreciate. So Professor Patrick was both a moderator from this morning and now a speaker. Thank you. Professor John Conley similarly spoke this morning, and so the introduction I'll give is brief, but I will just remind everyone the range of his experience. He's a professor of medicine at the University of Calgary, where he co-directs the Snyder Institute for Chronic Diseases. So he's a doctor by background and someone who is both involved actively in research as well as consulting, in particular for the World Health Organization in different capacities. So Professor Conley, thank you.
Thank you very much. So just begin here, and Dr. Patrick was very kind actually and insightful, because he emailed me a couple of times to make certain you don't cover the same material that I'm covering. So we actually exchanged slides so that we had a very different focus. And so I'm going to actually talk about issues pertaining to global strategies and focus on the international health regulations, which does have legally binding opportunities within it and has some legal teeth. I lived in Switzerland in 2011 for a year while I was on sabbatical. I worked part-time at the University of Geneva and also with the World Health Organization in the Department of Global Alert and Response, and was very engaged in the World Health Day report that came out in April of 2011. I did a lot of the writing and have been since involved, and am an active member of AJASAR, which looks at issues pertaining to antimicrobial use in food-producing animals. And just so you're aware, there will be an urgent meeting of AJASAR in October of this year to address the issue of colistin and the MCR gene, which Dr. Patrick had brought up in the last discussion. And there's a lot of other work going on as well in that regard. So I'm going to talk today about milestones in the Canadian international response, describe the international health regulations. So for those of you who may not be aware, I'll give you a sort of IHR 101, then how they may be applied to AMR, and what are the limitations of applying the international health regulations. I see this as a real goal, and this actually is a nice segue from the presentation from Steven Hoffman this morning about what are some of the legal pliers that we might be able to use on this issue. But I will tell you some of the limitations. So what are the international health regulations? It is a legal framework. So let me repeat, a legal framework for those of you who are in the law school. And when I was in Geneva, my office was just down from the lawyers, Max I'm trying to remember his last name, and Helge Homerson from Germany. I used to have coffee with them. We used to talk IHR about every second or third day. So I'm quite familiar, having been a neophyte on the IHR. They just threw it on a wall and said, learn this while you're here. And I thought, So now I'm very familiar with the international health regulations and including some of the nuances, although I am not a lawyer. So it's to provide, protect against, control, and provide a public health response. This is from Article 2 in the IHR. And just to give you background, it was adopted in 2005. Became effective in June 15th, 2007. It is a legally binding instrument on 194 member states across the country. It would have then passed through the United Nations, the World Health Assembly. Its scope covers diseases, but also illnesses or medical conditions, irrespective of origin or source, that presents a significant harm to humans. And I'll give you examples of that. It requires legally that countries report certain disease outbreaks. That's another issue, because while I was there, there was a big outbreak in Zimbabwe of cholera, and of course the national ministry said there is no cholera in Zimbabwe, don't worry about it. So this is an issue that occurs at the political scene. The components are that states parties to develop certain minimum core public health capacities. So once this is done, and a good example is Ebola, you must mount a response. So once Ebola was announced as an public health emergency of international concern, the so-called PHEC, the countries must, on legal grounds, respond to it in terms of the laboratory and clinical capacities. So it has teeth in it, and there must be a response. And we saw that with Ebola. Virtually every site in the country had to develop, and the provinces ramped up their efforts to be able to develop testing. There was infection control issues. So it is a big issue. Determining control measures, what resources are needed, and it is up to states parties who have signed on to this to notify the WHO, and then the WHO will collaborate in the response by providing technical guidance. And the notification criteria for a public health emergency of international concern, a so-called PIEC, it must have public health impact of a serious event. It's unusual or unexpected. Significant risk of international spread. And we heard about that in Steven's talk this morning. I have another slide that shows the air flight patterns over 24 hours. And just for those of you who don't know, Marc Ouellette told me there is much more, maybe 10 times as much ship travel. But currently it is estimated there are, based on the flight patterns around the world, probably 1 billion people who take flights and move from country to country over the course of a single year. And that is exclusive of ship travel. And then finally, a risk of international travel or trade restrictions, and this gets into issues with the World Trade Organization and the WTO, which is a big issue. The only 3 times in history it's been declared H1N1, which was a bit of a bust, then Ebola, in which they were slow to respond to the WHO, and it must be declared by the Director General of the World Health Organization, and then finally Zika, or more appropriately microcephaly, which was the end result of the Zika virus infection. So within Annex 2, it lays out the 4 diseases for which notification must occur, even with a single case. A new subtype influenza, and that's a concern over avian influenza. Secondly, polio, due to wild-type poliovirus. SARS, which has not come back since it emerged, and smallpox, of course. But within the update in 2007, there were 2 other categories, demonstrated serious impact, and then also potential epidemic impact, in which they labeled plague, cholera, viral hemorrhagic fever, which has now been embarked upon with the Ebola virus, which is a form of viral hemorrhagic fever, yellow fever, anthrax, and interestingly, antimicrobial resistance. So it made the list in 2007. And when you apply the AMR with a focus on carbapenemase-producing bacteria, I believe that you can make a case for this, particularly now with the concern over pan-resistance. If you have colistin resistance, and as Dr. Patrick mentioned, if that gets in the plasmid into the co-carriage of 14 other types of resistance, both chromosomal and plasmid-mediated, you would have, beyond extensively drug-resistant, you would have pan-resistant strains for which they are truly untreatable. Propensity for rapid spread, no geographic boundaries, few alternatives for treatment. As I mentioned, there's been a massive reduction in R&D. We saw that from the speaker from Boston about the massive reduction in the pipeline for new products. And so why is NDM1, the new Delhi metallobetalactamase, why are these new superbugs with the carbapenemase different than other types? As I mentioned, co-carriage up to 14 other resistance traits, now also with colistin, which is the last barrier of defense that we may have. The coexistence of NDM and KPC genes, which is another type of severe resistance, and now the looming threat of pan-resistance. It's also been present in E. coli, the most common cause. 80% of the women in this room will suffer a urinary infection at least once in their lifetime. If you get the E. coli that's got the pan-resistance, we're left with nothing to treat you with. We've also seen it now in the organisms of high public health importance, such as Salmonella, Shigella vibrio. There is now a growing spread in the Mediterranean basin of Salmonella Kentucky, which contains the carbapenemase gene and is leading to major difficulties with respect to treatment. And these are very promiscuous, very, very mobile plasmids, or so-called jumping genes that can move from one to another. And just to give you an idea of the spread of these super-resistant organisms, you can see here the multiple sites around the world where we have resistance of the more severe form for which the colistin plasmid may jump into. So to make a case of applying it to the international health regulations to be academic, and this is work that was based on graduate student work of which I was involved when I was in Geneva with Stefan Harbarth, who was the lead author. But I was the person from the WHO who had infiltrated and got inside info from the lawyers from the IHR. So looking at this from the yes-no perspective, yes, it's high impact. It's an E. coli, it's plasmid, high potential impact. Treatment failure, a no reason might be resistance is not new. Some people have said it's going to occur anyway. Do you really need outside assistance? It's not a visible concern. In some of the discussions, we said this is like a crisis in slow motion. So it doesn't have the immediate impact of an avian influenza, neither this nor in Ebola, which has a sudden case fatality. It's kind of a slow motion item. Someone mentioned like climate change this morning. Secondly, pan-resistance, so it's unusual or unexpected. The naysayers would say it's been around for years, don't worry about it. Third criterion, that yes, there are global epidemiologic links. We know that it's spread virtually to every continent, with the exception of Antarctica. Just too cold there, I guess. The naysayers would say no, there's a slow risk. It's going to occur over decades, not days to weeks. And is there a concern over trade or travel restrictions? I would say yes. We did find some case studies that Russia refused imports of pork and poultry based on the presence of antibiotic residues. So we know that antibiotics, and as we heard this morning, if you know that there are antibiotic-resistant organisms on foodstuffs, you cannot export them, and the country would have the right to deny. It's a process issue. So naysayers would say, don't worry about it. So we published a paper as a policy piece, and it garnered a fair amount of attention back in 2011 in PLOS Medicine, a call for action, applying the IHR to antibiotic resistance. Last year in New Orleans at the ASM, I was on a podium with speakers from NIH and CDC, and we made, again, the same call for action. This is pre-colistin resistance, so the timing is ripe to be able to take this back yet again to see if we can spur the WHO onto action with the application, which would then be legally binding on all its member states for carbapenemase resistance with colistin, which will be the new argument that we'll come forward with. And the prompt response from one of the naysayers was an editorial, the IHR designed to deal with acute problems, not such as Ebola, influenza, not these slow motion ones, which I would argue is not correct, and that it would not be disruptive to international trade. So that was the counter argument. Broadening the scope of the IHR is not appropriate, so that was the second argument. And then thirdly, it is a framework only, and it does not guarantee infrastructure, because once you apply the IHR, and the Director General states that this is a public health emergency of international concern, countries are obligated to ramp up their internal resources to be able to deal with it. So that is also something that member states would argue. India, China, we don't really have much resistance. The Indian government complained they don't want the name New Delhi attached to their organism. There's a lot of vocal response about that, and it's still ongoing. Some of the authors of that original paper have been ostracized in India as a result of this. But can we wait? And this is to show you a public health issue of the Salmonella enterica serotype Kentucky ST 198X1. France, Morocco, many countries, they have now been finding Cipro-resistant strains in the Mediterranean basin with OXA48 and VIM2, which are forms of carbapenemase resistance. The origins are in the East, North Africa, Middle East, and it is spreading. It is popping up more and more now. People are becoming infected with this. And if it has the colistin gene, and these are from food-producing animals, beware, we will have untreatable salmonella bacteremias. This is a major, major concern. Acknowledgements, Didier Wernley was the master's thesis student with whom we all interacted. He was the one that did this. The senior people in this were Stefan Harbarth, and also trying to find the other name, Elaine Kickbush, who is with the World Health Organization and is very well known for some of these international health issues. But again, we are going to be refurbishing this call for action now with the advent of colistin, and you will be hearing more about this as the future unfolds. Thank you for your attention.
Great. So as we get the slides up for the next presenter, we can take a couple of questions. Maybe I'll use my chair's prerogative to first to ask the first question. Professor Conley, one of the things you mentioned was the role of the international health regulations, and from my perspective, it seems like there's lots of advantages if we can fit antimicrobial resistance under that international legal framework. It already exists. There's a whole process. There's state buy-in. But I guess I was wondering for a bit more detail about what would we actually achieve if it was listed under there? I guess because when we think of the way that, if we simplify this problem of antimicrobial resistance, we can think of it as an issue of access, conservation, and innovation. The IHR helps us with surveillance, certainly. That would be one thing states required, but what about on the other parts of the problem?
No, thank you. Great question. So it helps with every aspect. So if I'll use it, and maybe I didn't elucidate this well enough, but if you use Ebola as an example, when Ebola hit, there were simulations in virtually all the hospitals in Canada. You saw on television, and everybody was trying on various types of garb for personal protective equipment. There were drills that were run, and that was a requirement that everybody do that. The laboratories all sharpened up their pencils, developed PCR capability testing for rapid diagnostics. And so you have a laboratory response, you have an infection control response. You can imagine there would be a stewardship response. So not like what we're doing now, which is voluntary, but it puts you under the gun, so to speak, with respect to the ramping up of resources that are required for both diagnosis, treatment, innovation, infection control, so all of those aspects, and it's legally binding in that you have to do it. The difficulty is, though, that many countries just fear that they would be ostracized if they were the country that had more of the carbapenemase. So India, for example, now China, with they would try to block it if at all possible because it creates huge problems with trade, medical tourism, and other issues. And it becomes a political issue about whether to apply it or not. And the WHO was very sensitive because they were late. If you remember, there were a number of articles in The Lancet and elsewhere, and a report that was extremely critical of their slow response to call Ebola a PHEC to mobilize, and yet they did it very quickly with H1N1 and felt burnt. So they did it fairly quickly for Zika. So, but again, the more acute, this would be the first time you had something that is of a little slower progression. And so there are a lot of individuals who argue against it for that reason, because of the implications of what it would be. And it's a very political issue, let me tell you.
Dr. Rainer Engelhardt?
Hi, John. Rainer Engelhardt, and thank you for that nice oversight of IHR, and as I would say, as enlightened an approach as that is. You didn't say anything about the level of compliance amongst the 194 member states, which is lacking in many ways. So perhaps you could elaborate.
Yes, thank you. Great question. So you're absolutely right in terms of the level of compliance. So Ebola, another example, or with influenza, many countries ramped up their activities. There were some, particularly low and middle income countries, they have a difficult time. They're struggling, with their resources, with just keeping their economy afloat, and it becomes very difficult. But nonetheless, there has to be a response consistent with what your capabilities would be within that member state. So, for example, if you look at one of the poorest countries in the world, Haiti, they would not be able to mount a response that Canada would, but nonetheless, they still have to be able to respond in some fashion. And I think with the H1N1, if I recall, there was a lot of mask use and increased infection control precautions. Even in those low to middle income resource countries, they did their best that they could. So you would absolutely have a variable response. But at least, on the other hand, there is a response to some degree. And perhaps with Ebola, many of the first world countries or higher income countries were able to respond in an effort to help some of those lower and middle income countries, which is again a humanitarian type of response.
Thank you very much. So I'm now going to introduce Dr. Marc Ouellette. Dr. Marc Ouellette is actually on this panel is the second person who's a graduate of our very own university here, the University of Ottawa, graduate in biochemistry. And in fact, the second being Professor Patrick, having done his biochemistry studies here and during the same years we discovered during the lunch break. So University of Ottawa really brings people together, not only on panels, but as in student days. Dr. Marc Ouellette is a professor at Laval University. He's been focused on this issue for most of his academic career, having completed his PhD, specifically focused on antibiotic resistance. Today, so he's a full professor at the University of Laval University, and he's also the scientific director of one of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research's institutes, specifically the one on infection and immunity. So, Professor Ouellette, thank you very much.
Merci, c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. En fait, j'ai appris l'anglais à l'Université d'Ottawa. Il y avait plusieurs cours qui se donnaient soit en français ou en anglais, mais il y en avait un qui s'appelait chimie inorganique, qui se donnait seulement en anglais. For that one, I was at par with everybody. Nobody understood anything. So, Anglophone or Francophone, that was the same. So, it's a great pleasure to be here today and to discuss about AMR. It's my field of expertise, and it's quite rare, actually. And actually, at the level I am, it doesn't seem to make a big difference whether you're a real content expert or not. But because this is my field of expertise, I'll just give you a little bit of historical background. So, the first drug screen ever that was reported was by Leverin-Menil at the Pasteur Institute in 1903. And the first drug that popped out that was killing more bacteria than an animal was arsenic. So arsenic has been the first drug that evolved from a drug screen. Also at the same time, there were Germans, dye people, chemists, physicians, but also dye people, the dye industry that was very big at the time. And there was Paul Ehrlich, who developed what was called a magic bullet. And that was also an arsenical derivatives. And actually, arsenical is a poison, but you know, for people having syphilis at the time, that was the only the only way of curing from it almost. So, but when he got his Nobel Prize in 1908, he indicated that resistance could be a problem. So resistant is something that is not new. Actually, there's we do have a lot of strengths here in Canada on resistance. There's a fellow called Jerry Wright at McMaster University that collaborate with people digging, you know, in the north where there were 30,000 years of ice carrot. Then they did the genomics of the bacteria present, and they found the antibiotic-resistant genes 30,000 years ago, before the advent of antibiotics. So resistance has always been in nature because the antibiotics are produced by organisms, usually by fungus or by bacteria, and it's part of ecological niche. And they want to defend themselves from others. You know, it's a competitive advantage of being able to produce those antibiotics. But if you produce them, you have to protect yourself against them. So this is where some of the resistant genes have evolved. And then, of course, when Fleming discovered penicillin I think you all know that it was a serendipitous discovery. Yes, he had a plate, and there were some bacteria on that plate, and then he left the plate, and then fungus grew on it, and around the fungus, there was no growth of the bacteria. So he was genius, because he said, well, maybe there's something in the fungus that is destroying, and then he discovered penicillin, and penicillin was a war secret, during Second World War. And, but also he recognized that resistance could be a problem. So we have to deal with a problem that has been always there, but with pressure, with selection, and everybody has been talking about selection, then this problem now is getting much bigger, especially in areas where antibiotic usage is higher. And now we're talking about hospitals, but we're talking also about industry. There was another workshop yesterday and the day before, and they've sampled sewage in Toronto. 67% of the sample in wastewater in Toronto have those new dilibetylactamase. Doesn't mean that it will come to human, but they're there, and it's just a question of the chaos that Dr. Patrick was talking about, that could just be all the wrong conditions where there could be this new apocalypse. So this is where AMR is. And it's even further complex. It's really intersectoral. And actually, I'm thrilled to have students from the Labo de stratégie mondiale du Centre de droit politique et éthique de la santé d'Ottawa, so that are thinking, wow, AMR is a global problem. It does touch many levels, and we should have a symposium on this. Because now, it's not only a health problem, it's not only an agriculture problem, it's not only an environmental problem, it's a One Health problem. So I'll try, and there was a question this morning, so what Canada can do? Well, Canada, will be involved in this equation, but it's a global problem. Canada is huge in terms of geography, smaller in terms of population, but educated, with a health system that has strengths, where I think we can make a difference. And I think one thing that Canada has shown is their collaborative nature also of the Canadians, where I think we could have an impact on the field of AMR. So I'll try to give you a brief overview of some of the, a brief overview of what have been some of the Canadian response to antibiotic. So this is a slide that everybody has seen. The nice thing about the O'Neill report, there's probably 6 or 7 versions of the same numbers. Yes, that if we don't do anything by 2050, there will be 10 million individuals that will die of AMR. And this is a challenge. This is an ethical challenge, because right now we say, okay, government could say, well, this is a problem. Let's do something about it. But what, to whom? I mean, industry is not interested, and we've understood it. There's good reason why industry is not interested. But I think there's a way forward. It's public-private partnership. So I think, it's the role of the government to protect the people that lives in that country. So one way is to find partnerships with industry. But this is where I think there will be a lot of legal implications, because, okay, I'll give you the example of Ebola. I mean, Canada was punching above his weight on all aspects with Ebola. We had a Canadian vaccine. When, after it was bought by Merck, now the Americans were calling it the Merck vaccine, but still, it was discovered in Canada at the NML, at the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. Now we've done, all the governments really were funding all the clinical research, the phase 1, the phase 3. So I saw that a lot of you here are collaborating with the Norwegian Institute. I mean, they were really, we did collaborate together in the Guinea trials. But now, this is a vaccine that is not licensed yet, and they need additional data. Merck, a multinational, say, we're interested in moving forward, but we're not making money out of this, so we need a public-private partnership. And now a number of, like Canada in this case, is collaborating with Merck to move forward on this. So, and I think with antibiotic, it will be a similar thing that will happen, because there's no commercial benefit of developing an antibiotic. It's $1 billion, and as soon as you have a new one, it will be protected. You won't be able to use it except in cases where it's going to be really needed. The law students here are involved and we're interested, but at the international landscape, there's a lot of activity. I think every of the speakers have talked about the G7 in Germany. In the health portfolio, there were 3 priorities: AMR, Ebola, and I was happy to see neglected tropical disease. So these were the 3 priorities last time, and we'll see how it will move forward. But one thing that I want to highlight here on this slide is TATFAR. So this is a transatlantic task force on AMR. It's Obama who said, well, we have to start something, and it was the president of the EU at the time. Yeah, I think it was the Spanish presidency at the time. They say we'll do something about this, and there's this task force. But they'll have to change the recommendation here. I cannot read from this angle, but for future collaboration between US and EU. But now Canada is a member of TATFAR. So now, now it's transatlantic in its reality, and Canada is involved, and Norway now is also involved. So it's getting a lot of traction. This is more at the policy level, at regulations, but I think this is key because these often are the political masters that will transcend to the bottom. So every country that I know of now have an action plan or a framework for antimicrobial resistance. 5 minutes. Is it the first time that you have to lift this? Or? No? Okay. Well, I'm not usually obeying to those things, but I'll try to do so. So antimicrobial resistance in Canada. So really, I think there's a coordinated effort really right now within Canada for looking at this. So this was really led by the Public Health Agency of Canada, Judith Bossé at the time, and now Teresa Tam. But Health Canada, the regulators are very important also, especially in the food aspect. There's been a major implication of Health Canada, CFIA, Agriculture Canada, and the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So we are, in contrast to the others, we don't do the work per se, but it's the academics that are doing the work on behalf of NCIHR as a funding agency, but not only a funding agency per se, because we do have strategies of the areas that we believe it's important to go in. So, and the action plan was 3 pillars. One is surveillance, one is stewardship, and the other one is innovation. So Steve this morning has described his triumvirate, which was access, which was conservation, that is basically stewardship, and innovation. And as you see, all the departments that, all the departments that are involved, the Public Health Agency of Canada, Health Canada, CFIA, CIHR, Agriculture, the National Research Council, and the former Industry Canada is now called Innovation, Science, Economic Development. So a lot of individuals. So it's really intersectoral. It's really a number of different approaches that are involved. CIHR, of course, is more involved in the innovation space, but we believe that you need innovation for surveillance. Now, surveillance at a point was, collecting bacteria like the Pasteur type of phenotyping. Then there was some molecular epidemiology, but now we're at genomic epidemiology. And really, there's a number of tools that needs to happen with surveillance. Same thing with stewardship. There has to be an incredible, there are some innovative space also for stewardship. But also, we need to develop new antibiotics. This is complex, this is complicated, and we have to find new strategies, but we have to find strategies for alternatives. I'm surprised that so far in this meeting, there was not a mention of a fecal transplant for Clostridium difficile. But this is really a new strategy for moving forward on controlling infections without the use of antibiotics. So alternatives, diagnostics is also very important to move forward in those initiatives. And actually at CIHR, the innovative space, if you want, are new drugs, diagnostics, alternatives, and clinical trials. So Canada is a complex country with 13 different health systems, and but a lot of people that have a goodwill, and as I said, it's a multi-intersectoral systems, and now there's a governance structure for AMR. And it's at a very high level. It's all deputy ministers, but it's the deputy minister of agriculture, the deputy minister of health, well, different deputy minister of agriculture, different deputy minister of health that are sharing this governance or this thing on resistance. But it's also the provinces, because we cannot achieve that without the help of the provinces. So on every committee, there will be a chair of a federal chair and a chair of the provinces to move forward. So this is tangible examples of the recognition of the complex space of AMR within Government of Canada. And this is the One Health approach, which is humans, animals, and environment. So this is a little bit what CIHR is doing. So, you know, in the last 15 years, there were $230 million invested in the field of AMR. So it's not negligible. And I've asked people to say, okay, what was invested in ethics, law, and social sciences and military relations? And there was the massive amount of $4 million. So Colleen is looking at me and saying, you pillar one, guys. But the people are also involved in international efforts. So this is the Joint Program Initiative on Antimicrobial Resistance. So it's 28 different countries. It started with Europe. Canada joined, Argentina, Japan. So many countries now are embarking and trying to forces to fight AMR to collaborative action. So really there's this effort. But when we started signing contracts between different countries on ways to move forward, there were some legal implications. And actually the lawyer at CIHR had to work on this. There are many, so this is one of the initiatives. I mean, there were a lot of discussion about the longitudinal price, but the U.S. also have their own price. IMI was discussed. So there's a lot of mobilization at the international level. And these are some of the funding initiatives that we've done with the Joint Program initiatives. And there's actually in the last budget, there was a line for AMR research, and now we're pretty soon of announcing what we're going to do with this investment, and hopefully it will contribute to the Canadian effort to AMR. So, but there are key points. So what is the role of the high-income countries? Because the problem is often in low and middle-income countries. So what is the collaboration that we'll have to do? Development of new drugs. I think this has been discussed many times here. And these PPP that I've talked about, I mean, there's so many points where we'll have to look at this to be able to go forward and to develop new antibiotics. And also, sometimes the innovation may be ahead of regulations. So how do we deal with this? You know, one of the first way of treating infections was bacteriophages, which are not used anymore. But now they're coming back because they need alternatives. But there are legal framework that may complicate this. So there's a number of aspects that we will have to deal with, and where I think legal counsel will be important. So I know that I've been a little bit over, so I apologize, but usually you're a nice timekeeper, because usually you would have come to me and bring me, but anyway, thank you for listening to me.
So before we launch into the last speaker, I'll just ask, if everyone lets me, I'll ask one question of Professor Ouellette, which is to ask about the figures, the CIHR funding figures. So one of the premises of this conference is very much that there's a problem with antimicrobial resistance that manifests as a biological and clinical issue. But the other half is the social, political, legal, ethical issues. But when one looks at investments, it's not half and half. But any thoughts on the way that we can maybe mobilize greater support for, or better take advantage of the Canadian research enterprise to advance knowledge on the social sciences part of it?
So out of the 230 million, 170 is bottom up. So you just have to apply. So basically, it's the people that have applied maybe were thinking it was more a biological problem, and so this is why you have that proportion. In the strategic envelope, and this is where we can make a difference and try to well, it will not be 50-50, no. but to try to make a better equilibrium. And then, yes, indeed, we could focus on other aspects. I have to say that, well, actually, one of the call that we've made was on alternatives. So it was about microbiome, it was about phages, it was about immunomodulation, so anything except antibiotics. So we've tried to, but I realize that this is still a biological aspect. So stewardship is part of our priorities right now, where I think now there will be more other aspects than biologicals, and maybe this is going to be something that you will be able. But most of the funding is bottom up, so it's really investigator driven.
Okay, I pass to Professor Patrick.
Thanks, Marc. That was a really nice overview. So, and as the token public health guy here, obviously other institutes have to get involved with this and are involved, but need to continue that. But in the I&I side, you've mentioned drugs, diagnostics, alternatives, and so forth. When it comes down to infections in the community and Canadians, a very large proportion of them are carried. There are resistance determinants carried on a couple of species: Staph aureus, uropathogenic E. coli. Where do you see the institutes in terms of a role in trying to accelerate vaccine development for those two pathogens?
Well, when I was talking about alternatives, there was one that I forgot and actually we're very much involved in is vaccine development. So I mean, the example of salmon was given, and actually in human health, Streptococcus pneumoniae I think is a game changer to have the vaccine. Of course, now we see a displacement of serotypes, but I think the vaccines will come better, and this is a way that because strep pneumoniae is the #1 bacteria in terms of AMR and problems within the community right now, or recognized as the bacterial. And actually, I was struck that Hep C was the first one. But so vaccine is clearly a way forward, and the same level of mobilization at the federal level is seen with vaccines as with AMR. So it's really, and it's agriculture, it's industry, and it's health. And Rainer Engelhardt, that is present, was involved in many of those discussions some time ago. So I totally agree that prevention is always better than treatment.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm pleased to introduce the final speaker on this panel, Professor Colleen Flood. She's a University Research Chair in Health Law and Policy here at the University of Ottawa, where she's also the founding director of the new Centre for Health Law, Policy and Ethics here, which is an exciting initiative that's bringing together faculty from across campus and linking the full range of expertise on these issues at the University of Ottawa with others outside. Professor Flood was the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy for a decade at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law before that. And she was also a former scientific director of one of CIHR's other institutes, the Institute for Health Services and Policy Research. And just on a personal note, Professor Flood really has been a mentor to a whole cadre of health law professors across this country. Basically, anyone who is an assistant or an associate professor of health law, who focuses on health law in this country, has benefited from Colleen's mentorship, and that includes me. So, Professor Flood, thank you.
Okay, I'm sure you're all a bit pooped, and I guess I'm going to do something a little bit different from what you've heard. Actually, you know, Marc and I are old friends from CIHR, and I thought he was about to tell you what actually happened to the dinosaurs was microbial resistance. I thought we were going to go there for a minute, Marc, but fortunately not. I guess. maybe the dinosaurs are still at CIHR in Pillar 1, do you think? No? Okay, all right. So just a little bit, we're very open-minded. Look, I think, you know, when we think about legal approaches and solutions to the problem of antimicrobial resistance, what we've heard today is a lot about what is the nature of that problem, what's the scope of the problem that we're talking about. We have to define that before we figure out what are our law and policy tools that we can bring to bear to help to solve that problem. So defining the problem is really important because, you know, if you've got the wrong nail, it doesn't matter, your hammer's doing the wrong thing. So figuring out what we should be doing is really important, and I think that there is at least some agreement about what is the problem, although we've heard it's a little bit like climate change and the environment and this and that and the other, which means there's myriad things, and that's usually an excuse in Canada to do diddly squat. Right, because we can always point the finger at somebody else and blame somebody else and so forth and so on. You know, I'm a pretty sort of linear sort of person, and so to me what it seems that I can see is a problem that is clear is the problem of overprescribing. That's, you know, it seems to have cut across all of the reports and everything that we've seen. Certainly my own personal experience with my own physician is a real willingness to grab the prescribing pad and write out a prescription for antibiotics. And I understand that there's some improvement with that, but I want to focus in particular on this issue of overprescribing. So we've heard a bit about, you know, the different initiatives at the federal level, less about the provincial level, interestingly, some at the international level. And the legal policy problem that we face is that while we have a global problem of antimicrobial resistance, it's global in nature, the tools that we have are largely provincial in nature. From a division of powers perspective, or should I say they are perceived as largely provincial in nature, and I actually dispute that, but that's the problem, is that the federal government doesn't think it can directly really get involved, for example, in the issue of overprescribing, because that's a matter for the provinces. Okay, so I want to test that and play with that some. I think then sort of further defining the problem, it's important to note that over 90% of antibiotic drugs for humans are prescribed in general health practice. So we had a whole panel today on hospitals, and it's not that that's not important, but actually, again, we seem to be getting the wrong nail here. From what I can see of what's out there, that this is a problem of prescribing in primary care practice by family doctors. This is where the real problem will be, and and so this is where we need to focus some of our attention. None of that has been discussed yet. And so this data about the 90% is from Europe, but I don't see why it would be any different in Canada. I've been trying to find some data on that, but in 2014, 65% of Canadians filled a prescription for an antibiotic, mostly from their GP. So that's a fairly significant number. Now, in terms of consumption of antibiotics, we sort of fall in towards the, we're not overeaters, if you like, over-consumers of prescription drugs in general, or of antibiotics. But there's an important caveat on that, as most of you probably know, which is Steven's point around access, which is obviously a huge problem in the developing world, middle-income countries and low-income countries, but is also a significant problem in Canada because we don't have universal drug insurance. So many people go without antibiotics that they actually need and drugs that they actually need because they don't have drug insurance. So we're consuming this level of antibiotics in the face of being the only country in the developed world with a universal health insurance plan that doesn't include drugs outside a hospital. And we know that this is a major problem in access. Some Dr. Gillian Booth and colleagues, for example, in Toronto, have shown that something approximating 5,000 people in Ontario under the age of 65 die from want of access to drugs like insulin. Diabetics, essentially, are dying from lack of access to prescription drugs. 5,000 people over 6 years under the age of 65 in Ontario from lack of access to prescription drugs in Canada. So we have an access problem right here in Canada, which makes me suspect that if we solve that access problem and we still continue on our way with our prescribing habits, that this would be a lot worse where we are on the bar chart, because a lot of people aren't even getting access to the drugs they need in the first place. So what are the factors contributing to overprescribing? Well, you've got that whole business of doctors going in there, patients going into their doctors and holding guns to their head and making them give them the drugs. This apparently happens almost every day in Canada. And that patients are very aggressive and seeking to have treatments that they shouldn't have and that sort of stuff. So undoubtedly there is an aspect of that. Hasty diagnosis, physicians not having the time or the inclination to educate patients because of the fee-for-service modality by which, they get a fee. They've only got a little window of time to see you, so it's kind of in and out. It is easier to give you a prescription. And that they're ethical/legal duties are to the patient in front of them and not for stewardship of antibiotics at a population level. So that, there is that as well. So there are a variety of factors that go into it, but, surely these are all remedial to some kind of regulatory solution. So most of you probably know about the adverse report from the Attorney General of Canada last spring, concluding that Health Canada and the Public Health Agency have not fulfilled key responsibilities to mitigate the public health risks posed by the emergence and spread of antimicrobial resistance in Canada. So, this is pretty damning a kind of assessment of what we've been able to do to date at the federal level, with all due respect to what Marc is saying about collaboration. The Auditor General doesn't normally say these sorts of things unless things are really bad. And on the topic at hand, sorry, Marc, but we're just going to have another dust up like we used to do. On the topic at hand, prescribing habits within the healthcare system, the Attorney General says that the information that the Public Health Agency, obtains on antimicrobial use in humans is insufficient. The agency buys information on antimicrobial use in humans from a private company. The information details the prescriptions dispensed by a sample of community pharmacies, the antimicrobials purchased by hospitals, and the physician's reasons for prescribing these antimicrobials. However, there is a need to obtain more information on usage in the healthcare sector and in remote populations, including Aboriginal peoples. So there's no decent surveillance, as far as I can tell, in what's going on. And I think that what we have then, we've talked about the WHO priority areas, and I'll just draw your attention to the second one there, rational antimicrobial use and regulation, because that's my focus here. And then you have the federal framework for action, which doesn't talk about that, except to, vaguely perhaps it's somewhere in there. But rational antimicrobial use and regulation. Regulation is something that the lawyers in the room understand, right? This is not mucking around and cooperating and just fuzzy stuff. This is actually making you do your job. Sticking to prescribing, guidelines, et cetera, There's a plethora of guidelines. One of my research associates described it as like a Ponzi scheme of guidelines on antimicrobial use, but with no firm oversight governance around it. Well, we can't just keep making guidelines that have no impact. So what could you do? So at the federal level, there are a range of different heads of powers that the federal government has vis-a-vis health that could speak to this, potentially. So it's not true that provinces have jurisdiction over healthcare, full stop. That's the end of the story. The courts have held that healthcare is a matter of shared jurisdiction, and even over things that we consider provincial matters. So there's criminal law powers. I won't go into this in too much depth. I don't think that this is a particular place to find what we need here. I can explain that in more depth in questions, but basically I think this would go down like a cup of cold sick. If we attempted to regulate in this area, we do regulate food and drugs largely through the criminal law power, but the courts have in a few recent decisions put a little bit more of a cold shower on the ability of the federal government to regulate through its criminal law powers, for example, with new reproductive technologies. The peace, order and good government power. Now this is probably the power that's sort of, for most people unfamiliar with the cases or what the judges have to say, would think, well, surely this is where the federal government would get its powers to regulate something of global significance, national significance, like antimicrobial resistance, right? Bugs just zip across borders. They have no sense of, the territory of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They just don't care, right? But again, this head of power has been interpreted very narrowly by the courts because of a fear of intruding too much into provincial jurisdiction. But I think that this is a potential power that could be used by the federal government if it wished to. I think politically it wouldn't go down very well, but it is a possibility for them to use. Now, the thing about how we regulate quality and safety in healthcare at the provincial level on the part of physicians right now is that it is largely a matter of self-regulation. By self-regulation, I mean that the provinces pass laws that empower the colleges, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, to regulate physicians in what they do. That's how we've decided to regulate safety and quality in healthcare generally, through self-regulation through the colleges. So you would think then that these guidelines, of which there are floating around a whole bunch of them, would be then a guideline picked up by the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons and applied, wouldn't you? But it's not. There is no guideline on antimicrobial resistance that we can find that the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons or any College of Physicians and Surgeons across this country have put in place and are actually requiring their physicians to follow. Why not? I don't understand that. That should be where the first place we should all be looking. And it's interesting, right, because we're all looking at the World Health Organization, and I mean, not that that isn't important, but here is how we regulate healthcare, through self-regulation, through the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and they do not have a guideline on antimicrobial resistance. I think that is a travesty, and they should have one. If they refuse to act, then one should be asking the provinces to intervene to make them. We've had to do that before, for example, in regulation of cosmetic surgery, where we had women dying having cosmetic surgery performed by family physicians in their kind of clinics. And so finally, the province had to intervene and force the college to essentially regulate these private clinics. But in the absence of that, the federal government, I think, could potentially regulate through the peace, order and good government power. Again, as I said, I don't think that would go down too well. So my recommendation, because I'm trying to find a solution here and I've got 1 minute, is that we think about doing it through the spending power. The spending power is the power, money talks, right? That is how we regulate through the Canada Health Act. If the federal government wanted all the provinces to come on board to meet certain federal guidelines around the use of antimicrobials, which could have been developed by the Public Health Agency, then it could do so through something like the Canada Health Act. If you play, we pay. And that would be one way, I think, that would be both legally legitimate and potentially politically feasible in our great country Just look outside, guys. But we still love it in our great country to deal with this question. So I guess in a nutshell, I'm saying not so much on the top down, guys. Look at the bottom where we really should be regulating. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Professor Flood. So we have something like 3 minutes to encourage some cross-panel discussion. But I think I want to just start by, there was at least one area where there was some very strong disagreements among panelists, and that was in terms of how Canada is doing in terms of its response to this threat of antimicrobial resistance. Maybe because Professor Flood, I guess you gave quite a harsh critique of the federal government. Maybe, I don't know if I can ask Professor Ouellette, maybe you can speak to those competing views, and then maybe Professor Flood, you can respond to that.
Absolutely.
Oh, great.
It's quite ironical that I'll do this, but I'll do this with great pleasure. And as I think you say in the law court, dear colleague, may I respectfully disagree with what you're saying? So I think that your reading of the framework or the action plan is possibly well, incorrect. I'm not sure it's the right term, but there are some specific actions that are. So it's not only blah blah. And I'll take the example that I'm the most aware of is change in regulations for antibiotics as growth promoters in animals,
right?
Where there are really some tangible changes, real changes that are happening. So I think this is a demonstration that there are some areas where they are taking part. I think the fact that there's the framing of this interdepartment or
sectoral.
Yeah, but not only sectors, but ministries. Sorry, interministries, agriculture, finance, not finance, but economy, health, that are working together. I think they do recognize the problem and they want to move forward. I'm personally, and maybe this is one thing that I forgot to say, declaring one conflict. I'm an optimist. So that's one of the conflict that I have, and I'm optimistic that the energy, the positive energy that is involved into this will make tangible changes on the problem of AMR. We do realize that we're not alone there. It's a global problem, and we will have to integrate. And the fact that we are now either within TASFAR Canada, but there are many, like the Global Health Security, where the Secretariat, I mean, I think you spoke about that it's not, but the Secretariat is being supported by the Public Health Agency of Canada from as far as I can remember. So there are tangible efforts to be involved into this. I do recognize that the Auditor General did describe areas where they need to be improvement. I think this was this action plan and the framework was in the work, so maybe now the assessment of the Governor General may differ. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to presume about this, but I think that there is global effort, and we do realize that we have to do that with the provinces. And this is why this is going to be a FPT effort. So I am an optimist, and I think I've seen rarely mobilization of that extent in the 6 years and 2 months that I've been working for CIHR.
Well, I'm going to let all the panelists respond, and then we'll wrap up. So first, Professor Flood.
Okay, I just want to say, but I love optimists. And I actually am generally an optimist too. But when it comes to issues of federal, provincial, so-called cooperative federalism, I think, the evidence, maybe this will be the example where we'll suddenly turn it around. But the evidence to date is that it isn't working. So, for example, information sharing around, Ebola, SARS, all these kinds of things, reporting to Public Health Agency. The idea was that the provinces would voluntarily provide this information, but as I understand it, still only Ontario has. And so this is an example of, it's not like this SARS happened yesterday. This is a long time and a lot of attempts to try to get this kind of cooperative federalism going, and it hasn't worked. But my point on the was around, in particular, over prescribing, and as I see the framework, it doesn't speak to that, more just we will work with provinces. And I don't think that that's good enough, given that we know that this is a major problem that we have. And then, as I said, what's really amazing is that where that problem should be being dealt with at the college level, it isn't. So that's, we can generate all the information we want in the world about what people should be doing, but we're all human and there are lots of incentives going against that. So simply educating people can have some impact on what they do. But you have to work on incentives and governance structures, and that's where lawyers come in, which is why we need a few more extra $1 million, Bubby.
So a quick final comment from Professor Conley, then followed by Professor Patrick.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that the Auditor General report, I agree, I was one of the main consultants to the Auditor General. And the federal framework came when they found out that the Auditor General took a very specific interest in this. The Auditor General took a very specific interest in this.
That was it.
There were a number of things, and personally, I was very critical and agree with the assessment that Professor Flood said Canada was not doing enough and they had dropped the ball. That was my individual assessment. But from the respect of the regulation, in fact, that was one of the recommendations that I made to the Auditor General in that report, which was that they need to do regulation, and in particular, a labeling on all antibiotic prescriptions about the scarce resource. We do it with tobacco products, we've done it with other things, but that there should be actually a labeling regulation that goes on every antibiotic prescription. It was in my report to them. They chose not to follow it. So if you could comment on why they chose not to follow what I thought was a very logical item that would have actually provided some regulatory framework to be able to address the exact point. It was very much discussed with the Auditor General's office.
Well, I don't know the reason why the Auditor General wouldn't pick that up. I know in general from labeling things, the evidence is very mixed on its uptake and input. So this is going to assume that a patient who's now in receipt of the antibiotic has got it in the palm of their hand is going to read that label and against their physician's instructions not take the drug. Or, next time think about it or something. So I can see just immediately, from that there may be some issues with that. Labeling of food products, for example, of tobacco products. From what I understand of the evidence, it doesn't actually make that much difference. It makes us feel better about things, but it depends, that's not a complete truism, obviously. So I don't know if there is any evidence about labeling antibiotics as a scarce resource, whether that would make any difference at all. Yep. I mean,
Professor Patrick.
I mean, maybe, the Canada's a land of pilot projects. Maybe you need to pilot it. But I would be reluctant to think that would be some kind of magical salve on this. Yeah.
Just a few additions from me. I mean, since John and I were belly aching at the Senate and with the Auditor General, some things have happened, other things have yet to happen. So, I mean, you know that you've got a strategy. You've seen much better availability of surveillance products. We saw Health Canada take action on these nosodes, which were diverting children away from legitimate working vaccines. And we've had the growth promotion thing, so there's still more to be done. But what I wanted to speak to was this question about addressing the physician prescribing. Now, I know it's not Central Canada, so maybe it doesn't count. But in your two westernmost provinces, you have 9 million people. And you have a common program which is theory designed based on addressing the demand from the consumer at school levels and up through the parents and that sort of thing, through all different sorts of social media and everything else, and at professional level. And there are published common guidelines that go to every family physician by app or by book and available online in both provinces that speak to not only the ideal antibiotics to use, but what to use instead of antibiotics when you don't need to use antibiotics. So that can be achieved, but I will agree with you on one point, and that is that we can do more. And we have some of the wrong people in the room here. We're doctors and lawyers. We need systems engineers. Because what the literature tells us is that when people get direct feedback on an inappropriate process, instantaneous, that's what will change the behavior the most. So we shouldn't be creating any more electronic health records that don't have that kind of feedback loop in. You've got a diagnosis of acute bronchitis, you're prescribing an antibiotic. Oops, that's not really a good idea. You should be doing something else. So I think the challenge here is to go from education alone, which gets us part of the way, to deliberate feedback, and that's where the colleges can help.
Well, I think, you know, the idea of the colleges and self-regulation is that at the extreme, you know, physicians that don't toe the line and overprescribe should be disciplined. That's essentially the, you know, and this is not a very popular thing for physicians to hear, but that's what's the nature of being a self-regulating profession. So it's not just about education. That is very important, but there will always be outliers. And, you know, as lawyers, we sort of go with the idea that, you know, there should be some consequences for not towing the line. And so I think that's what I said. I wasn't saying there weren't enough guidelines floating around. There certainly seem to be, but a systematic education program, you know, kudos to you and everybody that is involved with that. I think that's great, and maybe that's why you're getting that reduction. But, you know, another piece of this, which is an obvious piece of this, is what are the colleges doing?
Yeah, I'm just saying
So
that what the literature tells us is that the feedback itself gets you most of the way there. So the penalties might be required in an extreme case of recalcitrance, but the first thing we need to do is to provide people with feedback about how they're doing next to their peers.
So we have a passionate panel that cares a lot and wants to, and we can continue discussing, but let's give them a round of applause and thank them for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you again to our panel, and thank you, Professor Hoffman. So we'll just take a brief 5-minute break. On va prendre une petite pause de 5 minutes while the next panel comes up. And I encourage you all to go get some coffee, water, some food. There's lots of food left. 5-minute break, and we'll start again.